David Louis Adventurer. David Henry Louis 1917–23, October 2002, was a sailor, adventurer, doctor, and Polynesian scholar. He is best known for his studies on the traditional systems of navigation used by the Pacific Islanders. His studies, published in the book The Navigators, made these navigational methods known to a wide audience and helped to inspire a revival of traditional voyaging methods in the South Pacific. Early life. Louis was born in Plymouth, England, and raised in New Zealand and Rarotonga. He was sent to the Polynesian school in Rarotonga, where he apparently developed his appreciation for Polynesian identity and culture. He remained a New Zealander throughout his life, though he eventually retired to Queensland. After an adventurous childhood and teenage years, including mountaineering and skiing in New Zealand, and a multi-hundred-mile kayak journey, he traveled to England in 1938 for medical training at the University of Leeds and served in the British Army as a medical officer. After the war, he worked as a doctor in London and was involved in setting up the National Health Service. Sailing. With the announcement in 1960 of the first single-handed transatlantic yacht race from Plymouth, following a series of accidents including a dismasting shortly after leaving, he finished third. Francis Chichester came first, as described in his book The Ship Would Not Travel Due West. He later decided to sail around the world with his second wife and two small daughters and built the ocean-cruising catamaran Rehumona for this purpose. After an initial voyage towards Greenland, he entered the 1964 single-handed transatlantic race and picked up his family in the United States. They circumnavigated by way of the Strait of Magellan, the South Pacific, and the Cape of Good Hope. See his book Daughters of the Wind. This was the world's first circumnavigation by multi-hull. Following his long-standing interest in old navigational methods used to explore and populate the Pacific, he employed similar techniques for the Tahiti-New Zealand leg of the Rehumona voyage without using a compass, sextant, or marine chronometer. Study and literary career. In 1967, Louis acquired another boat, Isjorn, to embark on further field studies of traditional Polynesian navigation. With a research grant from the Australian National University, and with his second wife, two daughters and 19-year-old son, he set out for the Pacific again to study traditional navigation techniques. While there, he was welcomed into the cultures of various Pacific Islanders such as Hipper, who taught him their navigational lore, heretofore largely unrecognized by those outside Polynesia. Louis chronicled this voyage and research in various articles and in his books The Navigators and the Voyaging Stars. Louis' voyages and resulting books gave inspiration to the revival in traditional Polynesian canoe building and voyaging. In 1976, Louis joined Polynesian Voyaging Society's first experimental voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti on Hakule. The team successfully navigated using traditional methods to Tahiti. Louis departed from Hakule in Tahiti and went on to work in his own research. Along with Dr. Marion Mimi George, he proposed that original Polynesian navigation is still alive in the Polynesian outlier Tomako. Louis' next adventure in 1972 was an attempt at circumnavigating Antarctica single-handed. For this, he acquired a small steel yacht named Iceberg. Facing treacherous conditions in the Southern Ocean after departing, Louis was not heard from for 13 weeks, but eventually managed to sail the Iceberg to the Antarctic Peninsula under a jury rig after dismasting. Louis was rescued by personnel from the Antarctic Research Outpost Palmer Station, who subsequently repaired the Iceberg while Louis spent the Antarctic winter in Australia. After returning 8 months later, Louis left Palmer Station to complete the voyage, but that very same day was caught in a heavy ice field and had to be towed to open water by the RV Hero. Later, Louis capsized again and eventually brought the boat to Cape Town, South Africa. Edited aspects of these events are described in his bestseller book, Iceberg. His son Barry sailed the yacht back to Sydney from South Africa, where it underwent extensive work to prevent further corrosion. In 1982, Dr. Lewis donated Icebird to the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, Australia. After the Icebird voyage, Lewis was involved in setting up the Oceanic Research Foundation with the aim of sending private expeditions to the Antarctic. In a 17.4-meter 57 Ft. Allen Payne-designed steel yacht named Solo with 7 other crew, Lewis made a summer expedition to Antarctica and wintered over there 1977-78. Lewis spent some of his later years conducting research into traditional navigation techniques of the Inuit on the Bering Strait region. One obituary said of Lewis that he always brought his crews home intact. He was a typical Polynesian sailor, getting into trouble through haste and neglect, then, with near superhuman courage and seamanship, fighting his way out of it. Following this, he retired to New Zealand to write his autobiography, Shapes on the Wind, one of 12 books he wrote. In the 2001 Queen's Birthday Honours, Lewis was appointed a Distinguished Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to yachting and exploration. He finally retired to Australia and died at Gympie, Queensland. Publications: The Ship Would Not Travel Due West by David H. Lewis, 1961. Dreamers of the Day by David H. Lewis, 1964. Daughters of the Wind by David H. Lewis, 1967. Children of Three Oceans by David H. Lewis, 1969. We, the Navigators by David H. Lewis, 1972. Icebird by David H. Lewis, 1976. The Voyaging Stars by David H. Lewis, 1978. Voyage to the Ice. The Antarctic Expedition of Solo by David H. Lewis, 1979. Icebound in Antarctica by David H. Lewis with Mimi George, 1988. Shapes on the Wind by David H. Lewis, 2000.